meeting. Our final agenda item is a pretty robust one and certainly a very important one to our land use decision making at the county, and that is a general plan workshop. And so I think what we'll do here is kick it off to staff. I know they have a very thorough presentation. I think we have a few speakers, and then we'll spend some time on it as a board. So with that, let me turn it over to county staff.
Before staff begins their presentation, any members of the public that have requested to speak on this item, please dial into the conference line now using the instructions that were provided to you. You will be muted until it is your turn to speak. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair Fletcher. Joining me for this item are Rob Eford and Tara Lieberman. We will be presenting information on updates required by the state to the county's general plan, housing and safety elements, and progress towards preparing a new environmental justice element. The presentation is a workshop to highlight changes that must be completed by the summer of this year, receive direction from the board on staff's approach to the elements, and receive public input. The general plan is a framework for the county's future development and forms the foundation of land use planning through stated objectives, goals, and policies. It focuses on and applies to the unincorporated area only. It addresses topics such as land use types and densities, housing for all income levels, transportation networks and facilities, open spaces for conservation and recreation, and safety and noise policies. The last comprehensive update of the county's general plan occurred in 2011, although updates to parts of the plan have occurred each year since then. There are 6 elements in the county's general plan. We'll focus on 2 elements and introduce a new one. The housing element provides a plan to meet the unincorporated region's housing needs for residents at all income levels and at various stages of life. Jurisdictions must have a housing element and update it every 8 years. The county's next housing element update is due in April. Staff is taking advantage of a 120-day grace period provided by the state to hold this workshop, incorporate your feedback, and return in April with the status of our progress, and in the summer with final documents for your consideration. The state has recently made changes to certain components of the safety element, which requires an update that must also be completed by this summer, along with the housing element. This is to ensure that safety hazards are taken into consideration during the development of housing policy. Any jurisdiction with disadvantaged communities must incorporate environmental justice goals and policies in their general plan, either by January 2018 or when 2 other elements are updated at the same time. Since the unincorporated region has state-identified disadvantaged communities and both the housing and safety element are being updated, a new environmental justice element is being proposed for the county's general plan. The environmental justice, or EJ element, will establish policies to ensure fair treatment of people of all races, cultures, and incomes with respect to environmental laws, regulations, and land use policies. All the elements are connected to one another, and each contain goals and policies and implementation programs. The land use element designates the general location and types of housing, business, industry, agriculture, open space, and other uses in the unincorporated area. It also includes strategies to maintain and enhance existing development and community character. An example of a land use goal is to maintain the county's rural character. A policy that supports this goal is to assign densities and minimum lot sizes in a manner that is compatible with the character of each unincorporated community. The mobility element supports the land use element by identifying the major roads and transportation systems necessary to support the ultimate build-out of the land uses and densities in the land use element. The mobility element also includes goals and policies for multimodal transportation systems that provide for the safe, accessible, convenient, and efficient movement of people and goods within the unincorporated county. The conservation and open space element addresses the conservation, development, and use of natural resources. It includes goals and policies related to environmental conservation and air quality. For example, a policy that supports the goal of sustainable land development is to incorporate a mixture of uses within villages and rural villages that encourage people to walk, bicycle, or use public transit to reduce air pollution and greenhouse gas emissions. The noise element provides for the control and abatement of environmental noise to protect citizens from excessive exposure. It identifies and appraises noise problems within the community and forms the basis for distributing new noise-sensitive land uses. A goal is to maintain a noise environment that is compatible with the land uses and policies and is to increase setbacks between noise generators and noise-sensitive uses. The safety element identifies hazards to people and infrastructure and includes goals and policies to coordinate safety-related agencies and mitigate threats of hazard. An example of a goal is to enhance public safety and the protection of public and private property. A policy that supports that goal would be to coordinate between public agencies and private entities to remove debris and promote the rapid reconstruction of the county following a disaster event. It also includes hazard maps to inform the review of developments allowed per the land use element during the application review process. The housing element ensures that there is sufficient residential capacity available to meet the needs established by the state at various income levels. In addition to goals and policies that encourage production of housing and implementation actions to track progress of housing goals, it identifies available sites that could be developed to satisfy the unincorporated area's immediate housing needs. In comparison, the land use element identifies the ultimate residential build-out of the unincorporated county. An example of a housing goal is to have a housing stock comprising of a variety of housing and tenancy types at a range of prices. A policy in support of a goal would be to support the design of large-scale residential developments in villages that include a range of housing types, lot sizes, building sizes in all villages. The environmental justice element establishes criteria for identifying environmental justice communities and documenting the unique health risks experienced by these communities. The goal of the environmental justice element is to address legacy land use decisions that have placed industrial or polluting uses near minority or marginalized communities, resulting in negative health risks to community members. These policies and programs, developed as part of the EJ element, bring together partners from within and outside the county to provide a continuum of services to meet community needs and address historic biases in the land development process. Actions and procedures needed to implement each element's vision and policies are consolidated in an implementation plan. This includes activities, processes, reports, assessments, plans, and programs with established priorities and completion timeframes that are directly linked and cross-referenced to each goal and policy contained in the elements. The purpose of today's workshop is to highlight the approach to updating the housing and safety elements and identifying disadvantaged communities for the EJ element. Specifically, staff is seeking direction on the approach to the housing element site inventory, preliminary climate change adaptation goals based on a draft climate change vulnerability assessment, and options for including criteria beyond the state recommendations for identifying disadvantaged communities. Direction received today will be incorporated into a draft inventory of RENA sites and adaptation goals, which will be brought back to the board in April, along with the initial environmental justice goals and policies for further direction. Staff will then return with the updated elements for board consideration in the summer of 2021 to satisfy state requirements.
First, the housing element update and several proposed housing-related programs. The housing element ensures that the general plan provides enough opportunity for housing development for people of all income levels and life stages, including special populations such as homeless individuals, seniors, veterans, and people with disabilities. It double checks that that housing development is not being precluded due to lack of land zoned for housing, by verifying that the land use element designated enough residential land to accommodate both large and small multifamily developments, as well as single-family homes. This is also referred to as housing capacity. As part of the update, the county is required to evaluate what land is available for development to ensure it has the capacity to produce housing for households of all income levels through the 2021 through 2029 housing element cycle. If during the update process there is insufficient sites to accommodate the unincorporated county's housing needs, rezoning will be needed to increase densities. So how do we know if there is sufficient capacity to meet the needs of the unincorporated region? The Regional Housing Needs Assessment, also referred to as RHNA, allows communities to anticipate growth so that collectively the region can grow in ways that enhance quality of life, improve access to jobs, promote transportation mobility, and address social equity and fair share housing needs. Every 8 years, the state determines the total number of new homes the San Diego region needs to plan for, and SANDAG, as the regional planning agency, works with the county and the other local jurisdictions to distribute these units to each jurisdiction. The unincorporated county's share of the regional housing need for the 2021 through 2029 period is 6,700 units, divided into the 4 income categories shown on the slide. This is a decrease from the last cycle in which the county had to demonstrate capacity for approximately 22,000 units. The RHNA is further broken down into affordable housing categories, including very low, low, and moderate income. Middle income housing, which we will discuss later in the presentation, is not a state income category, but is included in the above moderate income category. Density, or the number of units per acre, is used as a proxy for affordability. The more units you can put into an acre, theoretically, the lower it will cost to purchase or rent the units. Densities to accommodate lower income sites include properties designated between 20 to 30 dwelling units per acre, which can accommodate larger multifamily housing such as apartments. The unincorporated county has a limited number of properties with higher density land use designations, resulting in a limited supply of properties that can be included in the site inventory to accommodate lower income housing. Moderate income sites include properties designated between 10 to 15 dwelling units per acre, which can accommodate smaller multifamily housing such as townhomes, duplexes, or triplexes. And finally, above moderate income sites include properties designated 7.3 dwelling units and below, which can accommodate single-family homes. Staff has conducted a preliminary analysis for the site inventory. The analysis shows that the county has capacity to accommodate its share of the regional housing needs for all income segments without needing to increase density for any properties. The draft site inventory includes sites that are located in villages within different unincorporated communities with access to infrastructure and services, that have been screened for environmental hazards such as floodplains, and that are without environmental constraints such as steep slopes or sensitive habitats. There are sufficient existing densities to support housing development at all income levels. We can give preference to sites outside these zones. However, we will need to increase density of other areas to offset the units that are removed. The site inventory relies on sites that were listed in previous inventories, but which are still found to have potential for housing development. It also added a program to require that residential developments provide at least 70% of the allowable density, and includes strategies to improve the likelihood of housing development in mixed-use sites, such as allowing residential as a primary rather than secondary use for certain commercially zoned properties. Staff also included criteria required by state law. For example, we've included a 20% buffer for lower and moderate income sites, as recommended by the state, to ensure that the county can maintain its housing capacity during the entire housing element cycle, even when development is built at a lower density than anticipated in the site inventory. By way of example, when a development is built at 10 units per acre on a site that allows 20 units per acre. The housing element also includes a program to incentivize development of affordable housing on lower income RHNA sites. The proposed ministerial affordable housing program would allow housing development that reserves 20% of their units for lower income households to be processed ministerially without a discretionary review. This process would facilitate the development of these sites by only requiring a building permit. After conducting the housing capacity analysis based on the criteria mentioned in the previous slide, staff was able to find enough sites to meet the county's housing needs for lower and moderate income housing. This slide shows the unincorporated communities that have sites that meet staff's criteria and are eligible to be listed for moderate and lower income categories. The sites are close to existing infrastructure and within villages. The analysis relies on existing housing capacity and where it's located based on locations from the land use element. For example, 38% of the RENA sites inventory for very low, low, and moderate housing is located within high and very high fire hazard zones, since much of the land in the unincorporated area is in high and very high fire hazard zones. And 55% of the county's total remaining residential capacity is located within high and very high severity zones. However, the board can direct staff to include additional criteria for the site inventory, such as to remove sites outside of VMT-efficient areas and those in high and very high fire hazard zones. If the board directs staff to change the approach for the site inventory, new sites will have to be identified, which will require a rezone to increase residential densities. Staff will return with a draft list of sites in April and a final list in a site inventory and a rezone program for board consideration this summer to meet the state requirements. The state allows the county to implement the rezone program within 3 years after adopting the housing element update. During this time, staff will conduct outreach and a review of potential environmental impacts for the rezoning of added sites. Of note, removing sites from the draft inventory does not preclude them from being developed. A downzone to reduce density is needed to preclude development on these sites. This action would require an amendment to the land use element of the general plan and is a separate process. Given the information provided, should the county continue with the current approach without increasing densities or rezoning, or should the county identify an alternative approach and develop a rezoning program? In 2018, the board adopted the housing affordability strategy, and since then, several programs have been implemented, including a density bonus program that provides additional incentives beyond state requirements to further encourage building of units, and an accessory dwelling unit and junior accessory dwelling unit ordinance and fee waivers and pre-approved plans to make it easier to develop ADUs and junior ADUs in the unincorporated county. Together, these programs have helped the county to increase housing production. For the second part of our discussion on housing, staff will present 2 programs that were previously directed as part of the housing affordability strategy. Specifically, an affordable housing program or inclusionary housing ordinance, which would help incentivize housing development for lower income and moderate income families, and a middle income density bonus, which would incentivize housing development for middle income families. The programs are not required by the state as part of the housing element update, but can be used as tools to incentivize housing development. They can be completed after the adoption of the elements in summer 2021. The general plan includes implementing policy H1.9, affordable housing through general plan amendments, which requires developers to provide an affordable housing component when requesting a general plan amendment with more than 50 units. However, this program has not yet been developed. As part of the housing affordability strategy, the board directed staff to identify options for requiring developers to provide an affordable housing component when requesting a general plan amendment of 50 or more units. To date, staff have researched other jurisdictions' programs, conducted outreach to market rate and affordable housing developers, held public workshops, prepared a development feasibility analysis, and developed 2 preliminary options. Today, staff is requesting input on the scope of these options. First, we could develop an affordable housing program under which the county would not require a specific set-aside, but would negotiate the number of affordable units with the developer during the GPA process. A second option would be for the county to develop an inclusionary housing ordinance. Under this ordinance, the number of affordable units would be predetermined as set-asides, typically a percentage of the number of market rate units. Both programs would apply to general plan amendment projects with 50 or more housing units and would require developers to provide affordable housing for lower and moderate income households. In addition, flexible compliance alternatives such as in lieu fees, land donation, off-site development, and acquisition and rehabilitation of existing affordable housing can be incorporated into both programs. A third option would be for the board to direct staff to develop one of the programs and to extend its applicability beyond general plan amendments with 50 or more units. Direction is being requested on whether to continue to develop options for an affordable housing program or inclusionary housing ordinance based on previous board direction. Additionally, the board can direct staff to develop either program and extend its applicability to all housing projects. If directed by the board, staff will develop options for a program and will return to the board for direction at a future time not related to the elements. As previously directed, staff also evaluated options for expanding the county's density bonus program to middle-income families. Currently, the density bonus program provides private developers with additional density and incentives in exchange for the development of affordable housing for lower and moderate income families. This includes families earning up to 120% of the area median income, or approximately $111,000. There are two options the county can pursue. First, the county could continue to develop an expanded density bonus program to provide additional density and incentives for the development of housing targeted at middle-income families, or families earning between 120 to 150% of the area median income, roughly $111,000 to $140,000. Staff is not recommending this option because the economic analysis conducted showed that the market is able to produce units that are affordable for middle-income families, and expanding the program could take away from the development of lower and moderate income tiers, which need additional incentives to be produced. A second option is for the county to continue monitoring the progress of the existing density bonus program and recommending changes as needed. Should the county continue to develop options for an expanded density bonus program to provide additional density and incentives for the inclusion of housing targeted at middle-income families, or continue to monitor the progress of the existing density bonus program and recommend changes as needed. If option one is directed by the board, staff will continue to develop options and return to the board for direction at a future time not related to the elements.
Since 2018, the state has required local jurisdictions to update the safety element each time the housing element or local hazard mitigation plan is updated. Since the county is updating its housing element, we must also update our safety element. The safety element establishes policies related to future development that will minimize the risk of personal injury, loss of life, property damage, and environmental damage associated with natural and human-caused hazards. Today, we are asking the board to provide input on 6 preliminary climate change adaptation goals developed as a part of this update. The county's current safety element focuses on wildfires, geological seismic hazards, flooding, hazardous materials, law enforcement, and airport hazards. The update will include new information and new policies related to evacuation routes, hazard mapping, climate change vulnerabilities, and adaptation strategies. The county is one of the first jurisdictions in the state to conduct a new evacuation route analysis. Unfortunately, since the timing of this evaluation is driven by the housing cycle, the update to the county safety element will be completed before the state publishes final guidance on how the evaluation must be prepared. Once this guidance is available, the county will complete its analysis and align it to state standards. The safety element will be updated again with the local hazard mitigation plan in 2023. The 2021 update will include new hazard maps based on current data. Hazard maps are used when processing new land development applications to help new development avoid known natural hazard areas. The new climate change vulnerability assessment and adaptation goals and policies will identify the impacts of climate change, develop strategies to protect people and infrastructure, and increase overall resilience to the effects of climate change. These policies will support the county's in-process Climate Action Plan update. Climate change is being included in the safety element for the first time in this update. The effects of climate change are already occurring at a global and regional scale and are projected to worsen existing hazards in the unincorporated region over time. Addressing climate change requires an integrated approach that targets both the sources of climate change and its effects. Efforts that focus on reducing or preventing the sources of climate change are termed climate change mitigation or climate action. Efforts to reduce harm from the effects of a changing climate are referred to as climate adaptation and resilience. This is the focus of the safety element, which complements other state and regional efforts that focus on prevention. In order to identify adaptation and resilience strategies, the county has prepared a vulnerability assessment for the unincorporated area. The county's vulnerability assessment was prepared in accordance with the state's 2020 Adaptation Planning Guide and follows the 4 phases shown on the slide in order to identify how climate change may worsen existing hazards and create new risks to people and community assets, the vulnerability of key population groups and community assets to climate change effects through available data and public outreach, existing plans, policies, and programs already in place that help address climate impacts and assess where there are gaps, and develop new goals, policies, and adaptation strategies to fill these gaps and increase resilience to climate change. Phase 1 includes scoping and defining the adaptation planning effort. It documents existing climate change mitigation and adaptation efforts, establishes the regulatory setting of the analysis, and identifies the roles of key stakeholders and contributors to the plan. Phase 2 includes an analysis of potential climate change impacts and adaptive capacity to determine the vulnerability of populations, natural resources, and community assets. Phase 2 has 4 steps. It defines exposure of the unincorporated region to hazards such as wildfires, landslides, and flooding as they relate to primary climate change effects, such as increased temperature, changes in precipitation patterns, and human health hazards. It identifies sensitive populations and assets and potential impacts. Certain population groups may suffer disproportionate harm or may be especially vulnerable to localized climate change effects because they have pre-existing health conditions or because they may not speak English and therefore may not understand communications and warnings about hazard events. The vulnerability assessment also categorized the type of assets that may be affected by climate change and expected potential impacts. Categories considered included transportation, energy, water, habitat, and emergency services. This phase reviews existing state, regional, and local plans related to the climate change prevention and adaptation to determine existing capacity to adapt to forecasted climate change hazards. And finally, Phase 2 performs a vulnerability scoring, which combines the level of threat posed by different climate change effects to the ability of a population or an asset to adapt to those effects. Those vulnerabilities with a high potential for a climate change effect and a low ability to adapt would receive a higher vulnerability score. In all, 36 climate vulnerabilities were assessed. Phase 3 uses the analysis conducted in Phase 2 to inform the preparation of the adaptation framework and strategies. Phase 3 has 4 steps. It summarizes vulnerabilities based on their scoring in the vulnerability assessment and synthesizing into a set of understandable issue statements, confirms vision and goals through public outreach. It prepares adaptation strategies that respond to the issue statements. These strategies identify actions that can be taken by the county, either on its own or in coordination with regional partners, to address risks posed by climate change. And lastly, it prioritizes strategies based on factors such as effectiveness, cost, and co-benefits with other climate mitigation and adaptation efforts. Phase 4 relates to the cyclical and ongoing nature of adaptation planning. Some implementation actions will be included in the safety element for consideration by the board that goes to the state this summer. Others will be developed in subsequent studies and plans and incorporated as part of the periodic update of the safety element. The preliminary adaptation goals from phases 1 through 3 are based on climate data, research, and public input. This slide shows those preliminary topics that are addressed by policies for each goal, as well as the departments and partner agencies that may implement the policies. The policies that are developed based on the adaptation goals will be used to evaluate development proposals during project review and CEQA environmental analysis. Projects will be evaluated for consistency with these policies, and if inconsistent, project conditions or mitigations may be required. Goal 1 focuses on protecting vulnerable populations and increasing their resilience to climate change through outreach, education, and support services. Goal 2 seeks to increase the resilience of transportation systems and infrastructure through proactive planning, maintenance protocols, project site reviews, and designs. Goal 3 focuses on the ability to strengthen and protect energy resources from physical damage and to reduce strain on energy systems by decreasing energy demand. Goal 4 adapts to the potential of future water scarcity through reducing water demand, increasing groundwater recharge, and increasing resilience of stormwater systems against flooding. Goal 5 centers on protecting biodiversity and habitats through revegetation programs, ecological recovery programs, and co-beneficial agriculture and habitat preservation programs. Goal 6 addresses adequate capacity to address increased need of emergency services through education and collaboration with regional partners and healthcare providers. Staff requests that the board consider and provide input on the outcome of the vulnerability assessment and preliminary adaptation goals developed through the assessment process.
We will now review the approach to the environmental justice element. Low-income communities and communities of color often bear a disproportionate burden of pollution and associated health risks based on legacy decisions that place industrial or polluting uses next to these communities. Environmental justice seeks to correct these inequities by reducing the pollution experienced by these communities and ensuring their input is considered in the decisions that affect them. Environmental justice is defined as the fair treatment of people of all races, cultures, and incomes with respect to the development, adoption, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. Environmental justice can be incorporated into the general plan by developing a standalone element or by integrating goals and policies into other elements within the general plan. The county will be developing a standalone environmental justice element with the intent to create goals and policies that address the health effects caused by the built environment. These goals and policies are being drafted based on best practice research and stakeholder engagement and will be available for review in March and in April. The environmental justice element programs are intended to span environmental health programs, public health programs, social programs, and law enforcement programs. Today, staff is requesting board direction on one of the first steps to establish an environmental justice element, which is how to identify environmental justice communities. Cal EnviroScreen 3.0 is a tool used by most local governments to begin the process of identifying environmental justice communities. This represents the minimum number of communities that should be included in the environmental justice element to satisfy state requirements. California's Environmental Protection Agency uses Cal EnviroScreen 3.0 as a scoring system to compare all state census tracts on such topics as environmental effects and exposure, sensitive populations, and socioeconomics. It was last updated in 2018. Examples of the indicators used are air and drinking water quality, location of hazardous materials, poverty, linguistic isolation, asthma rates, and cardiovascular disease rates. Cal EnviroScreen 3.0 identified 2 census tracts in the unincorporated region that are disproportionately affected by the environmental pollution. They are located in northern El Cajon and Lemon Grove. Recognizing that there's opportunity to include more, staff incorporated locally identified communities that have significant health issues, are more affected by crime, and are less engaged in civic activities. Examples of the indicators used in identifying these communities are air quality, poverty, and crime rates. These communities were defined as Live Well communities in 2016 as part of the Live Well San Diego vision and framework to address wellness and equity in all underserved communities of the county. Layering Live Well communities on top of Cal EnviroScreen 3.0 increases the number of census tracts by 15. A total of 17 census tracts are proposed. These include the communities of Northern El Cajon, North Lemon Grove, Spring Valley, and Sweetwater. Staff has begun analyzing data regarding these communities' existing conditions and will begin drafting goals and policies to address these conditions. Continued civic engagement will be conducted to ensure the community input is gathered during the drafting of the goals and policies. Next, we will go over additional disadvantaged communities and additional disadvantaged communities identified, additional state disadvantaged communities, and the California Healthy Places Index. The board could direct staff to incorporate these into the environmental justice element after meeting the minimum state requirements in June of this year. The first definition that could be considered is one provided by the California Department of Water Resources, which defines disadvantaged communities as areas with an annual median household income that is less than 80% of the statewide annual median household income. This is collected from the Census Bureau's American Community Survey. Incorporating this into the identification methodology would increase the number of census tracts by 15, bringing it to a total of 32. The 15 new census tracts include the general community planning areas of Pendleton, Duluth, Palomar Mountain, North Mountain, Borrego Springs, Julian, Crestahisa, Mountain Empire, Pine Valley, Potrero Tecate, Lake Morena, Boulevard, and Jacamba. Another data set that could be considered is California's Healthy Places Index, which is a scoring system that predicts life expectancy. The purpose of the Healthy Places Index is to prioritize public and private investments, resources, and programs. It uses data collected from 2011 to 2015 related to socioeconomic and health information. A sample of the 25 indicators used are air quality, lower income levels, two-parent households, and access to automobiles. If we continue layering and add Healthy Places Index on top of the proposed environmental justice communities and Water Resources Board's disadvantaged communities definition, the number of census tracts would increase by 49, bringing it to a total of 81. The third is low-income communities defined as census tracts that are at or below 80% of the statewide median income, calculated by California's Department of Housing and Community Development, or HCD. This would add one additional census tract if we continue the layering process, bringing the total to 82. And this includes the community of Spring Valley. This slide is a composite of all the available data. The proposed methodology is to satisfy the state requirements for the EJ element by June, including 17 census tracts defined by the state's California Environmental Screen 3.0 and livable communities. The additional statewide data identifying disadvantaged communities include the Department of Water Resources, California's Healthy Places Index, and state low-income communities. One or all of these data sets could be directed by the board as additional layers for inclusion in the first iteration of the in the future iterations of the environmental justice element. They represent a total of 82 census tracts out of 178 census tracts within the unincorporated county. Let's review our options. The first is for the board to direct staff to continue with the existing methodology of using Cal EnviroScreen 3.0 and Live Well criteria in identifying the state disadvantaged communities. Second option is to include additional communities as defined by other state disadvantaged community definitions. This would require additional community engagement after the adoption of the environmental justice element. Finally, the board could direct staff to continue with our outreach and research and return to the board with options based upon community feedback, modification of existing data, or identification of new data sources. Staff seeks the board direction on whether additional criteria could be considered after adopting the 2021 EJ element. If directed to include additional criteria, staff will begin the outreach efforts to engage with additional communities, identify goals and policies, and return to the board after satisfying the state requirements in June with a future update to the EJ element. Based on board direction received today, staff will return to the board in April with a draft inventory of the RENA sites, draft adaptation goals, initial environmental justice goals and policies, for those communities identified to satisfy state requirements. Then staff will return in June with updates to the housing and safety element and the first iteration of the environmental justice element for board consideration. Work can continue to incorporate additional environmental justice communities and goals and policies if directed by the board after June. This concludes staff's presentation, and we're available to answer any questions and discuss the options provided to the board as part of this workshop.
Thank you. Thank you for that. I think we obviously have a lot we have to work through on this item. I think why don't we go ahead and go to public comment, and then we'll come back for board deliberation and discussion.
Thank you, Chair Fletcher. I will note that we received 19 e-comments on this item. We have 15 requests to speak on this item. We will be calling speakers by the last 4 digits of their phone number. You will hear a notification that your call has been unmuted. You will then need to press *6 to unmute your phone. Each caller will be asked to state their name for the audio record, and you will have 2 minutes to address the board. You will hear this sound when your time is up, so please conclude your comments at that time. And I would remind the public speakers that they should mute their TV or their live video stream before they begin speaking. Erin, if you could please identify the first caller.
Thank you. Our first caller is 0612. 0612.
Good afternoon, Chair Fletcher, Vice Chair Vargas, and Supervisors. My name is Angelique Kalanog, representing the San Diego Regional Chamber of Commerce, whose mission is to make the San Diego region the best place to live and work. I'm here to comment today on the overall workshop and process. We appreciate county staff for hosting this workshop today, and we support updating these important elements in the creation of the environmental justice element. Updating the elements are crucial to continuing the work to address the housing crisis in our region. The county must continue to find innovative solutions to incentivize housing for all levels of income with inclusiveness and equity in mind. Especially in the midst of a pandemic, the housing shortage has social, economic, and health impacts on the region. The Chamber believes robust community engagement and timeline transparency is critical to the development of strong public policy, and we hope that this is one of many future workshops on the update process prior to the county submission in the summer. We encourage staff to continue to engage the public throughout this entire process, and we hope to be involved in the ongoing discussions on how we can provide more housing for all San Diegans. The Chamber is here to help directly connect the county with any industries that you'd like to reach out to on this effort. Thank you for your time and consideration.
Thank you. Our next speaker is 5563. 5563.
Good afternoon, Board Chair Fletcher and distinguished members of the Board of Supervisors. My name is Ryan Maxson, Vice President of Government and Public Affairs of the Greater San Diego Association of Realtors. I am here on behalf of our Board of Directors to provide some brief comments regarding the housing elements. In particular, our request for continued community stakeholder engagement on this important issue. For starters, as Realtors, our members are dedicated to helping more San Diegans realize their dream of homeownership. And we certainly share your concern and the concern of so many in our state regarding the high cost of housing that creates not only housing uncertainty, but also a tremendous barrier to homeownership, especially among families in our underserved communities. We also know that our lack of supply continues to be the primary driver of these escalating housing costs and issues we've discussed for a number of years. In fact, we partnered with the San Diego Regional Chamber of Commerce in 2017 to study the permitting and construction activities throughout our region. What we found at that time, and indeed this remains true today, is that our region was only developing 50% of housing needs for the region. What's more, middle-income housing permits suffered one of the largest deficits and was referred to as a missing middle. What we learned was that building for middle income didn't pencil out. And this is particularly concerning because our lack of middle-income housing inventory most impacts the would-be first-time homebuyers and working families. However, the recent documents provided today by staff indicate, among other things, that a middle-income density housing program may not be necessary. These findings, and indeed much of the potential direction and information included in the attachments today, would benefit from significant consideration by stakeholders. Given the importance of these issues, including the new addition of items this cycle, such as the environmental justice element, we'd be grateful for some additional time and outreach from staff to provide community stakeholders with the most recent findings and direction and ensure that relevant feedback can be provided. Thank you so much for your leadership on these important issues. We are certainly grateful for the work of the staff and for the opportunity to provide comment today.
Thank you. Our next speaker is 2750. 2750.
Good afternoon, Chair Fletcher, members of the board, Dan Silver, Endangered Habitats League. Regarding the housing element, the county's regional housing needs assessment was reduced, but the proportion of lower income units increased. We concur with the approach proposed for the housing element, which tries to actually construct these lower income units. We concur with the accessory dwelling units and with inclusionary housing, and also with the density floor for multifamily housing. Density bonus should not be used for market rate units. We caution that lower income housing, like all other housing, should not be placed in the most dangerous fire zones. Please do not accept a false choice of safety versus housing. In regard to the safety element, this draft is deficient in terms of ignoring the central role of land use and fire safety. The draft safety element contains no measures to reduce expansion of the wildland-urban interface where fires start and loss of life and property occur. The draft element does nothing to keep people out of harm's way. New homes built to the new codes burn anyway, and evacuations are notorious for failing, often with tragic results. To improve the safety element, our primary recommendation is not to intensify land uses, for example, through density increases with general plan amendments in the most dangerous fire zones. There is no reason to make a bad situation worse. This also fits in very well with the revised climate action plan. We've submitted various other mechanisms in writing. We would very much like to work with you on fire safety. In terms of environmental justice, we fully support the creation of this element to address the historic burdens that you've heard about. We urge continued coordination, however, with environmental justice organizations. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Our next speaker is 8046. 8046.
Good afternoon, supervisors. This is Noah Harris with Climate Action Campaign calling to comment on the housing and safety element updates, as well as the new environmental justice element. First, I want to urge the board to ensure each of these general plan sections is aligned with and working to implement the forthcoming climate action plan and regional sustainability plan. These plans will transition us off of fossil fuels, helping the county achieve zero carbon as soon as possible and no later than 2045 as the most up-to-date climate science says is necessary. These updates provide the county with an opportunity to meaningfully interconnect all plans and policies to tackle the climate crisis with urgency. Additionally, with half of the county's emissions coming from on-road transportation, the board must prioritize smart growth policies that increase mixed-use density and affordable housing near job centers and transit to reduce vehicle miles traveled and GHG emissions. Building sprawl developments in high VMT, high fire hazard areas remains one of our region's greatest sources of skyrocketing emissions, threatens our natural and working lands, and increases the likelihood and severity of fatal wildfire events. And finally, as the climate crisis has and will impact communities of color and low-income communities first and worst, we urge you to use the environmental justice element to direct investments, including GHG reduction measures, to the residents most affected by environmental injustices and our changing climate. These investments must be outlined in consultation with local leaders and organizations representing those communities. Thank you for using this opportunity to secure a more equitable and climate-safe San Diego. Thanks.
Thank you. Our next speaker is 9364. 9364.
Hi, this is Michelle Krug. I just wanted to speak to, I really appreciate the environmental justice element. being a part of this. I appreciate the workshop to talk about what other options can be added to our regional housing needs assessments, and specifically around the low income, the very low income. I learned that it's at 50% for the very low of AMI. That honestly seems too high. I know the city of San Diego uses 30% for the extremely low, and then goes from 30% to 50% for the next level. But here it's 50% to 80% for the low income, and moderate is 80 to 120. To me, that's too high. So I would like to see those lowered. And I also would like to see I know staff is asking for 10% of inclusionary housing, and I would really appreciate seeing this raised to a minimum of 20%, if not 25%. And again, I don't know whether you're using the very low or the low as inclusionary, or if that even includes moderate, but that is not going to take care of our working families that need to get shelter. Thank you.
Thank you. And our next speaker is 3550. 3550. I understand this speaker also wants us to show some slides while he speaks. So 3550. Please press *6 to unmute yourself at this time.
Could you please pull up my PowerPoint?
Yes, it is showing on the screen now.
Great. Members of the board, Dwayne Urquhart, master developer of the Pepper Tree Park project in the unincorporated county. Regarding the housing element, the study you commissioned stated that the unincorporated county is in a housing crisis due to the lack of lower to moderate income housing. While the premise is true, the study did not address current properties such as ours and the problems that we're facing to propose less intrusive down zones or rezones to provide more affordable housing at moderate density levels. By background, the Pepper Tree project was the first zero energy rated project in the county. The project is a village infill in a defensible zone, consistent with the intent of the county 2020 general plan to concentrate development in the urban core. Further, the project has ideal housing location within walking distance of commercial services, schools, public transportation to reduce potential greenhouse gas impacts. While the study states that local community resistance can be an obstacle for more affordable housing, that is not the case here because of the moderate density level. The presented project received unanimous approval from the local planning group, with several public members speaking in support of keeping our essential nurses, teacher, police, firemen, and the like housed in the community. Could you please change to the next slide? This slide was provided by the Director of Planning, showing the PDS internal timeline for any project, much less a project which is to be expedited because it proposes lower to moderate income housing. Based on this information, our project should have been before this board over 2 years ago in December 2018. Can you change to the last slide? The left-hand table shows the expected PDS project processing timeline. The right-hand table shows the actual timeline, which is still ongoing.
Thank you, sir.
Moreover, government section 694 requires scoping letter responses within 30 days.
Thank you.
As you can see by the side.
Thank you. Your time is up, but the slides have been shown and they will be included in the record. Our next speaker is 9065. 9065.
Good afternoon. My name is Lonnie Lutar, and I am speaking as an advisory board member for the Asian Business Association of San Diego because CEO Jason Pagiel had a scheduling conflict. As we all know, we are in a decades-long housing crisis. The general plan has not produced the housing needed for our workforce and has fallen sharply below its own housing target. Our employer members within the county have shared that workforce and middle market housing is a top concern. If employers continue to see talent leaving the region because workers are priced out of the housing market, there will be a tipping point where it makes more sense for them to try to locate elsewhere. While our organization would have liked to provide more substantive recommendations on the housing and environmental justice policy proposals in the staff report, we did not have adequate time to do so because we only became aware of this item coming forward late last week, and there was no outreach to us at any time prior. I'd like to share a compare and contrast that I think you'll find quite striking. The city of Carlsbad held 14 public meetings on its housing element in 2020. There are approximately 115,000 residents in Carlsbad, and like the county, they conducted a public input survey. They received over 4,000 responses. Meanwhile, there are 3.3 million residents in the county, and yet the county only received 55 responses to its survey. Beyond the survey, the county held 3 engagement events for the housing element with participation from a mere 23 people. That's correct, 23 people. I think we can all agree that 55 responses to a survey and 34 people participating in webinars and workshops cannot be considered a robust outreach program for issues of this importance. In summary, it would be premature to send the draft housing plan to the state for review without truly robust, sincere, and effective efforts at obtaining input and recommendations from stakeholders and the community. Thank you for your time and consideration.
Thank you. Our next speaker is 4458. 4458.
Good afternoon, Matthew Adams, representing the San Diego Building Industry Association. We're an association of 650 member companies representing a workforce of over 35,000 men and women. I first want to start and thank the county, and we're very appreciative for their commitment to finding solutions to the housing crisis. It's certainly something that we are all striving for. The housing element discusses inclusionary housing and the need for flexible alternatives. What is also required is an aggressive regulatory reform strategy coupled with fee relief to offset additional costs of providing deed-restricted units in any inclusionary program. Now, a similar exercise in the city of San Diego was done a few years ago, and it exposed the need for such reforms. There was extensive research done. Of 119 individual performers that had an inclusionary requirement, 85% of those performers resulted in higher rents and home prices, and that defeated the whole intent of the policy to begin with. A proper balance is essential so we don't end up with ultimately fewer units overall at a higher cost. Now, such reforms to the county's ADU program resulted in a substantial increase in production, and you can see in the report that they are expecting it to play a big role in meeting URENA numbers. So it's demonstrating that incentives and reforms produce results. The BIA is still evaluating the 100-page AECOM report that was released on Friday that includes that the market is taking care of middle-income housing. Now, aside from affordable, it's that type of housing that is in of greatest need. Now, we could debate whether or not the market's producing the product, but there's no debate that it's not being produced at the numbers that we need. Middle income is an essential run in the housing ladder, and you can't move up that ladder without middle income housing. Now, the report states that the overwhelming majority of homes built last year, there was only 1,200 homes built in the unincorporated area, and only 20 were multifamily.
Thank you.
So we urge the county to work on a housing element that actually produces units with incentives and reforms.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Our next speaker is 1601. 1601.
Hi, my name is Belle Hazelhurst, and I'm a neighbor on a little tiny island in the county between Vista and San Marcos. And you will be hearing more from me at the March 3rd Board of Supervisors meeting. I just want to say today, First, good afternoon. And my main thing that I want to say about changing any of the zoning in any pre-existing neighborhoods in the county, and it's obvious we need more housing everywhere, is that you have got to look at the pre-existing infrastructure, particularly the roads in these neighborhoods, before you approve. We have a situation here that's just sort of classic of problems that can happen when you add high density to low density areas that don't have the infrastructure. And so then what seems to happen is you all wait until the developers come in to improve the roads. So the residents are left for decades with inadequate roads and inadequate parking, which is always a problem, by the way, when you increase density, when you put high density units. There's always an overflow of parking onto the neighborhood streets. So I just want to emphasize how important it is that you include neighborhoods, that you look at the pre-existing structures that are available when you're adding density to any area. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Our next speaker is 6678. 6678.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Celeste Della Victoria, living in the unincorporated area of the county in the sphere of influence area for future annexation into the city of Vista. I am against this piecemeal approach to density increases and rezoning amendments to the general plan, allowing a onesie-twosie approach for developers to streamline the process will create havoc in our local communities. You are exposing us to constantly fight against high-density projects in low-density neighborhoods. This is opening up a Pandora's box and a floodgate to developers. I welcome development that fits within the community, is in accordance with or close to our current zoning, but I don't approve of high-density forced into low-density areas. Homeowners need protection against these type of zone changes. We need you to protect our villages of two-lane country roads and rural atmosphere. Why else is there a general plan if you just ignore the zone and the way in which the community was built upon? We need a holistic approach to development and not a throw the dart at the problem approach to our county housing needs. It's also especially important to protect areas with obvious future annexations into nearby cities, like my property in Vista. Please don't ignore recommendations from the city planners. For example, in November, your planning commission chose to ignore the city of Vista's recommendation to not support this large 62-unit townhouse project called the Smilax Townhouse Homes. It goes against the city's general plan. We will be annexed into the city. It's not a matter of if, but when. So please be sure that the housing plan will include and refer to the recommendations of the local cities that are within the sphere of influence. In closing, high-density rezone changes to the master plan should only be allowed where current infrastructure exists and very near main artery roads. Please don't bisect and divide our neighborhoods, add congestion, traffic, and problems to our low-density areas.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is 5785. 5785. Please press *6.
Hello, can you hear me now?
Yes, hello.
Okay, perfect. Hi, good afternoon, supervisors, and thank you for the opportunity to speak. My name is Johann Espinoza, and I'm the Executive Director for the San Diego Housing Coalition. Today, I'm here to speak on item 4 on today's agenda. The San Diego Housing Coalition understands the serious housing shortage facing the County of San Diego. As we transition to increase our housing stock to meet our goals, it's important to put the needs of our communities first by addressing issues of equity and access, sustainability, and health and wellness. Our organization is a strong advocate for smart neighborhoods that promote home ownership and rent opportunities, along with the high quality of life for households of a variety of income levels. While we commend and thank the Board of Supervisors and county staff for working arduously to update our county housing plan, While addressing safety and environmental needs, we find there are certain portions of this presented plan that fail to place our underserved communities at the center of this conversation. I've submitted a letter to you all with more details on this. Thank you again, and have a great day.
Thank you. Our next speaker is 1785. 1785.
Yes, hi. I welcome this opportunity to speak. My name is Craig Jones. I'm a resident of County District 3. What I want to emphasize is, yes, affordable housing is a critical need, but also a critical need is effectively addressing climate change. The county cannot hope to have an adequate climate action plan unless the county ends sprawl development. If sprawl resolved affordable housing, then the LA area would be affordable, the Bay Area would be affordable, and even the New York megalopolitan area would be affordable. And of course, they are not, in spite of their history of sprawl development. Other more effective strategies are available to successfully provide affordable housing. This is not a zero-sum game. Both ending sprawl and affordable housing must be achieved. I've submitted a more cogent and complete written testimony piece. It should be distributed to each of you on the board. Please do read it, I ask you. Where there's a will, there's a way. So please show the will to end sprawl and provide affordable housing at the same time. And let me just note that for the county, ending sprawl means sticking to the original 2011 general plan geographic limits. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Our next speaker is 0413. 0413.
Good afternoon, supervisors. My name is Clifton Williams. I'm a land use analyst with the law firm of Latham & Watkins, representing Goldendorf Farms, a hospitality and agricultural business located in the Twin Oaks Valley area of the unincorporated county. We offer the following observations and recommendations with respect to the county's housing element update. Goldendorf supports housing element option 2 for an inclusionary housing ordinance to finally implement the 2011 general plan housing element policy H1.9, which requires large-scale general plan amendment projects to include affordable housing. In 2012, the county told the State Department of Housing and Community Development that they would develop an inclusionary housing ordinance to implement this policy in 1 to 3 years. That later became 3 to 5 years and 5 to 7 years. Now, 10 years later, the county appears finally poised to make good on the policy that it put in place in 2011. Inclusionary housing ordinances are not new or novel, and as your staff report notes, have been in place for decades in jurisdictions throughout San Diego County. The city of San Diego has had an inclusionary housing requirement on all projects for more than 15 years, and in 1992 implemented a 20% inclusionary affordable housing requirement on new development for the future urbanizing area, which is the area in the general vicinity of the 56 freeway. Finally, the county cannot simply refuse to implement its general plan. The result of that inaction was made clear in the court's decision in Elton Forest Harmony Grove Town Council versus the county. The court stated the county argues that policy H1.9 is inapplicable because the county has not yet adopted an ordinance authorizing it to require affordable housing. However, the county provides no authority that an ordinance is required before it can require affordable housing. Since the county has not shown that it is legally precluded from requiring developers to provide an affordable housing component when requesting a GPA, its failure to do so here is inconsistent with policy H1.9. Therefore, we urge the county to take long overdue action on general plan housing element policy H1.9 for all future large general plan amendment projects. As part of the larger housing element, we urge the county to consider an ordinance applying the inclusionary housing requirement to all projects and an ordinance that would prevent the destruction of existing affordable homes.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Your time is up. Thank you.
Thank you. And that concludes public testimony on this item. Chair Fletcher.
Thank you. And thank you to the staff for the very thorough presentation and walkthrough that we have, and all of the callers certainly for calling in and participating. Before we start, I think I'd like to ask Sarah to walk us through the outreach and engagement efforts that have been taken to date. And then really kind of frame, as I look at this as a board, we have multiple kind of decision points that we need to make, primarily in 5 key areas. Obviously, RENA housing site inventory is one. We have some options: affordable housing, inclusionary housing areas, middle income density bonus, adaptation goals and vulnerability assessment, and then environmental justice communities, where as a board, we need to work through some options and some recommendations and considerations. But Sarah, if you could just walk us through the outreach efforts and then kind of the decision points for the board today and what we need to do before we get into board member comments.
Thank you very much, Chair Fletcher and members of the board. There have been some outreach efforts as it relates to the elements that we have presented to you today, but there's certainly more that will be conducted. We felt that this would be an appropriate time early in the process for us to come before the Board of Supervisors in a workshop to really receive some additional guidance from you if there are additional facets that you would like for us to evaluate as we conduct that future engagement with our communities. Some of the things that we heard today that I felt it would be important for us to highlight, there were some concerns raised by some of our community members and speakers that we are somehow changing the general plan, and that certainly is not the intent of what we have before you for consideration today. Really, the elements are not changing the zoning for purposes of the county's general plan. This is, as far as the housing element is concerned, we have new RENA allocations from the San Diego Association of Governments, and we need to be able to literally on a map show that we have the capacity to meet those housing needs at the various levels that we saw on a prior slide that Tara was covering as part of her presentation. There are some jurisdictions that are not able to demonstrate that capacity, and that's really part of the public policy exercise for purposes of the state of California. So consistent with the zoning that we currently have as part of the land use element that staff provided the presentation on, the exercise for purposes of the housing element is for us to be able to show where those units could be placed with the existing zoning that's part of our current general plan. So that's the effort before us for purposes of the housing element. What staff highlighted was that really for purposes of the state's requirements, we only have to use, so the minimum requirement would be to use the Cal EnvironScreen 3.0, which is the team provided information on. If we provide the disadvantaged as it relates to the environmental justice standpoints, we would only have 2 different census tracts out of our entire unincorporated community that would meet that threshold and criteria. So as we look at the environmental justice element, what we are recommending is that we go beyond that state requirement and include some of those additional criteria that were established as part of our Live Well communities that increase the number of census tracts to the 17. And staff presented that we can go beyond that in really looking at some of the other definitions as it relates to disadvantage to increase census tracts within additional unincorporated communities that we would then be able to engage with. But at a minimum, our recommendation would be to go beyond the Cal EnviroScreen 3.0, those 2 census tracts, increase it to the 17, and conduct that engagement. And that can serve as the pilot, in essence, for us to be able to come back to you and see if you would like to expand beyond that. That would not be, if we expand beyond the 17 census tracts, we would not be able to complete that effort by the June deadline or the summer deadline that we have for purposes of providing our environmental justice information to the state, but we would be able to move forward and revise our environmental justice element to create additional census tracts that we would be focusing our policies on. For purposes of the safety element as well, is the team provided there are some policy areas that we have reviewed and looked at, and really the guidance is as we continue this engagement with our communities, should we broadening those areas from those that were highlighted in the presentation to include some others. Those are the specifics related to the elements. The other aspects that we have before you for consideration, really as we look at the inclusionary housing, density bonus programs, those facets, they are not related to the elements, but we felt it important for us to include as part of this conversation because all of these are tied with one another, and just wanted to present these during the workshop. There is also a comment made about the 3 million residents and how we include all of them for purposes of our community engagement. What I would just share is for us, it's for the unincorporated community, so it would be for our unincorporated community members who would be weighing in on the land use designations for purposes of the communities. If there was a desire for purposes of down zoning, that would really impact our land use element, and that would be a different process for us. And some of the speakers highlighted that as well, where there would be further community engagement. That would be about a 3 to 4 year process, and it would really be an update, in essence, to the general plan from a zoning standpoint.
So essentially, thank you for that, Sarah. What we need to do today, and I like the, I think it's supplemental in the materials that have been provided to the public, is essentially the breakdown of each of these sections, what our options, our general options are. Kind of, you have an option 1 and option 2 with some layers underneath those. And it seems like the most efficient thing to do as a board would be to work through these one at a time. So why don't we do this? Let me, if there's some broad questions, let's go back to the board for 1 second. And I want to give my colleagues, if you have some broad comments or questions of staff around process or overall what we're doing, I think we should do that. And then I think the most efficient way to do this would just be to take each of these 5. So you see right there, as we scroll down on the screen share, as you go down a little bit, you see right there, that's number 1. We've got to decide option 1 or option 2, and then what we want to do. And then there are actually 5 of those. And so I think the most orderly way to do this would just be to work through each of these, have some board discussion, take a vote on what recommendation we would like to provide, and then move to the next one. But before we begin that, let me just pause for a moment and ask any board members if they have any overall questions, not comments on anything in these 5 specific, but overall questions, comments, things for staff. And I see Supervisor Desmond has his hand up. Supervisor Desmond?
Sorry about that. I'm ready to move into the.
All right. Everyone ready? All right, let's go to number 1, RENA housing site inventory for inclusion in the updated housing element. Sorry, staff, let's go back to the screen share and put that up.
What recommendations first?
All right, so we've got option 1 or option 2, and then some choices in option 2. And so let me go back to Supervisor Desmond on this one.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Appreciate it. And you know, I was on Sandag and we had this RENA, the RENA numbers come up, and quite familiar with it. You know, I would recommend, you know, putting this out on the floor as option 1 to direct staff to maintain their current approach. We've already got the locations or I guess areas designated for the capacity or the numbers that we have. My only thing what I would like to do is with option 1, in option 2, I like the fact that it says avoid sites in very high fire zones. I wouldn't mind adding that as a bullet to option number 1. And so I'll make that a motion to accept option number 1, to add the bullet to avoid sites in very high fire zones. I think this is the best way to move forward. Rezoning is going to be a real chore, and I think it's going to just take a lot longer to you know, try to find all those sites and do the rezoning. So I'll throw that out as a motion for option 1 with the addition.
Chair Fletcher, you're on mute.
We have a motion by Supervisor Desmond to adopt option 1 with the addition of avoiding sites in, was that high fire or very high?
Either one. I guess high is the lower of the 2.
Okay, so it would be, we'll just say high and very high zones. That's a motion. Is there a second to that motion?
I'll second the motion, but I'd like to add more to it if we may.
Sure.
So under the additional criteria, would it be appropriate to include access to water? You know, we in the past have cited Borrego, and there's no water in Borrego. It's just not going to happen.
So, yeah, we're getting really close to making option one, option number two.
Yeah.
Like we're basically, I mean, the only things in option two are high fire and very high fire. So if we just check those two boxes and then under additional criteria, you were to add water, we're essentially at option two without checking the avoiding sites from specific unincorporated communities. Essentially, I mean, it's you know, it is having them modify their approach, but if we're going to take everything out of option two and put it in option one, that's not really maintaining its current approach. So I think let's hear Joel. Why don't we kind of get everyone's thoughts out there, and then we'll figure out how we try to put them all best together. So Supervisor Anderson and Supervisor Desmond, your motion's still on the table, seconded by Supervisor Anderson. Supervisor Anderson has a concern about adding criteria around water availability.
Correct.
Okay. Let's go to Supervisor Lawson-Remer.
Yeah, so I just want to echo what Chair Fletcher said, right? You know, basically what they've put to us is they've identified sites that are already zoned for the level of density that would meet our RENA allocations. And if we add additional criteria, then there may be a need for rezoning. So you can't, it is not an option to do option one and add additional criteria, because now that is by definition option two. So that is like not a valid motion. So I think what I want to, that being said, I want to just express my thoughts and sort of general thinking, and then a suggested way forward, and not make a specific motion at the time, because I know there's already a motion on the table, but I do want to get my orientation out there that we can put, sort of consider together. I think the main thing that is missing to me in option one is consideration of vehicles mile traveled. And really being intentional about looking for communities that would reduce vehicle miles traveled, I think is really important to consider as an additional bullet. That's one thing. I think the other thing that was not clear to me is it says sites with access to infrastructure and services. I'm wondering if that also includes anticipation of infrastructure and services, particularly transit infrastructure, that will likely be coming online in the next coming years, right? So this model is like very backwards looking and static of like what currently exists. And so I want to make sure that we're also incorporating attention to where we're going to be seeing additional transit options and prioritizing those. So looking forward at transit options and reducing vehicle miles traveled are the two bullets that I would like to make sure that there's attention paid to. That being said, I am concerned about asking staff to come back for the board's consideration a new inventory that gives them such a long laundry list of bullets that in order to meet those bullets, it's either A, impossible, or B, we're having to like upzone all over the place in order to meet those bullets. So what I would like to propose is that we, and this is not a motion, but like something for us to consider and think about how we might move forward, is identify the considerations that might be more extensive than the considerations on option one that we'd like staff to consider, and then ask them to come back with two options for our consideration, for the board's consideration. One is an option that takes into account all of these bullets to the best feasibility without doing any rezoning. And then a second approach that comes back that says, okay, we took in all these bullets into account, and we would and here's an approach that would meet these bullets if we did consider rezoning, so that we would have coming back to our consideration a new set of two options, one that considers all our bullets, again, without any rezoning, and a second set of options that consider our bullets with potential proposed sites for rezoning, so that we're actually able to compare apples and apples in our next board meeting, or else we're just going to get sites. We're going to send them on a goose chase, and they're going to come back with a whole bunch of proposals about upzone sites. At which point, I think a lot of us, including me, will be really unhappy about that, and then poor staff is going to be running in circles.
Got it. So it's essentially your preference would be some form of option 2. With
option 3 that hasn't been put out.
Yeah. So it is directing staff to modify the approach, and then we'd outline some things that we want modified, but to then bring us back 2 pathways that are generally consistent, or as consistent as feasible. One that would require zoning changes, rezoning, one that would not.
Correct.
Okay. Let me ask real quick, county staff, if they have any thoughts on that. Is that a doable pathway forward on this one?
Supervisor, yes, we can certainly take a look at the option 3 and come back with those scenarios.
Okay. All right. We got that. Let's go to Supervisor Vargas.
So would that be a substitute motion?
Well, yeah. Why don't we get all the thoughts out there, and then I'll try and encapsulate them as best we can into a substitute motion, and then we can go.
Parliamentarian Chair Fletcher can figure out how to translate it into a motion.
It's my favorite part. Okay, so I am in support of option 2, and I also would support all of the recommendations that Supervisor Lawson-Remer recommended. So I guess at option 3. I did have a clarification though. When we look at the document and we avoid the sites located in the high fire, very high fire, what is the actual amount of housing opportunities that are going to be moving forward?
Supervisor, through the chair, in either scenario, we're going to have to at least identify sites with capacity for 6,700 units so we can meet the state RENA requirements.
Thank you for that clarification.
Okay. So let me try and encapsulate kind of where we are. And I do think, Supervisor Desmond, I think this kind of will, let me walk through where we are, and then we can see. So essentially it would be to adopt option 2, direct staff to modify the approach to identify sites based on the following criteria. That would be avoiding sites in high fire zones, avoiding sites in very high fire zones, with the additional criteria being availability of water, consideration of vehicle miles traveled, and access to transit or potential transit lines. And then ask them to return to our board with 2 options to present to us about how they would best fulfill that purpose without rezoning, and then a second option of how they would best fulfill that purpose with rezoning, and then our board would be able to better consider the path.
Slight modification. I just want to make sure that staff doesn't think we're directing them to ignore all the current criteria. Okay. We're adding additional criteria. Yeah.
Yep. Understood. So I would put that out there as a substitute motion. And Supervisor Desmond, I think it's going to give us options to come back for potentially rezoning or not rezoning.
On the water issue, I mean, Borrego has to cut back over the next 20 years the amount of water that they have. I mean, I don't want them penalized with this, because actually they have a lot of land available for affordable housing. They have a ton of empty lots out there, but there is going to be water available throughout this time. It's the farmers that are having to cut back about 75%. So I'm a little bit wary of adding in there that, or taking out Borrego. I guess that it has water available I guess I'm okay with that, but I'm not trying, I don't want to exclude Borrego from any sort of housing opportunities.
Yeah, and I think on that, it is just general water availability for housing. I mean, I think they'd have to look at all the factors you just mentioned as a part of that.
Yeah, so they're cutting back, but they don't have zero water. So it is where I'm trying to get to. Okay, well, so it sounds like you got a substitute motion, which is fine.
Okay.
Okay.
Would you like to second it?
Not really. It's
all right. Would anyone else like to second it?
I'll second it.
I'll second.
All right. All right, thank you. We have a substitute motion by myself, a second by Supervisor Lawson-Remer. I'll just repeat it one last time. It is to adopt option 2, direct staff to modify approach, identify sites based on the following: avoiding locations in high fire zones, avoiding locations in very high fire zones, with the additional criteria to analyze water availability, VMT impacts, and accessibility to present or potentially future transit options, directing staff to prepare and return to the board consideration for 2 paths to achieve these intentions as best feasible, one that requires rezoning and one that does not require rezoning. With that, we have a motion and a second. I think we should vote on each of these individually. I'll ask the clerk to call the roll.
Thank you. Supervisor Anderson?
Aye.
Supervisor Lawson-Remer?
Aye.
Supervisor Desmond?
I'll support it. Thank you. Aye.
Vice Chair Vargas?
Vargas, aye.
Chair Fletcher?
Fletcher, aye.
That motion passes unanimously with all supervisors being present and voting aye.
All right, let's move to number 2 here. Affordable housing program, inclusionary housing. On this one, we'll pull it up on screen. We'll go first to Supervisor Vargas. Let's get it up on screen here. On this, we essentially have 4 options with multiple choices to make in a few of these options. Let's see if we, it's not gonna fit on the screen. All right. So I know the public has available to them in the materials provided publicly, the document we're looking at here on the screen, that I think all supervisors have it. Essentially, 1 is direct staff an affordable housing program. 2, option 2 is to develop an inclusionary ordinance. 3 is not to do affordable housing program, and 4 is not to do inclusionary housing. So, look at that. You all fixed it. All right, let's start with Supervisor Vargas.
First, I want to say, Chair, to the team and the staff, that this is like the best document I've ever seen. I feel like I'm in school trying to do a test, and it's been very helpful so that we could be very thorough in this process. So I just want to give kudos to the staff for that. But all kidding aside, I do want to make sure that we are building affordable housing, and the momentum really is right now for the inclusionary housing ordinance is the only guarantee being presented to get more affordable housing produced. So if we're going to focus on inclusionary ordinance as staff recommends, then let us be bold, have bold goals to catch up to the need and provide as much as affordable housing for county residents. And so the first one, I'm not in support of option 1, as the affordable housing program does not include a mandatory minimum set aside requirement. I do recommend that staff advance the inclusionary housing ordinance option 2. I would also recommend further development of option 3 to consider all housing development and not only projects requiring a general plan amendment. There should also be a minimum threshold for the amount of units that would need to comply. I know staff is proposing 10%, but I think that we should look at 20 or 25%, and those would be my recommendations.
Okay, so your suggestion is option 2 with the 3rd sub-option there?
Yes.
Got it. All right, is that you gonna make a motion there?
Yes, I make a motion.
All right, let's go to Supervisor Lawson-Remer.
Great. Well, then I can second Vice Chair Vargas's motion, because I also strongly support option 2, sub option 3, where we're developing options for an inclusionary ordinance applicable to all housing projects of all sizes. And again, I just want to, in making this motion, I want to emphasize options, right? So I think I want to build on Chair Vargas's point, Vice Chair Vargas's point that 10% is a possibility. It might be 20%. I think we need to be looking at options and being as aggressive as possible, and as well as looking at options for minimum sizes of developments. And just asking that when we do have staff come back with this report, that we have some pretty granular analysis to better understand what the cost and benefit impact would be of these different options for an inclusionary housing ordinance using different parameters. So this is a second, a strong second to Vice Chair Vargas's motion.
If we can, I want to go to staff. I don't think they were necessarily recommending percentages, just kind of sharing some options, but let me have them clarify that.
Yes, Supervisor, under the term options, we would certainly explore all the different avenues and bring that back for board consideration, and that could include 10%, 20, or others. At this time, we do not have a specific recommendation on the threshold amount. The specific direction that we're seeking is whether it should be applicable to general plan amendments of 50 or more units, or large developments of 50 more units, or just all development in general.
Got it. Understood.
Thanks.
All right. Supervisor Desmond.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. On the options to come back with, Matt, I'm sorry, one of our callers mentioned about something about incentives and reforms. In San Marcos, when I was mayor there, we had inclusionary housing. I think it was either 10 or 15%. And what we found out was that builders were trying to build the least amount possible and trying to get around it and not build as, just do the minimum. If we incentivize, if we really want affordable housing, we should be incentivizing them to build as much as possible and to max out, on that site, the number of affordable housing units. So I would hopefully that the options in there would include potential incentives and reforms so that builders, would be incentivized to build these type of projects instead of trying to do the minimum.
Got it. So Supervisor Desmond, if I think you're proposing a friendly amendment that it would say develop options for an inclusionary ordinance applicable to all housing projects of all sizes above a minimum threshold, including options for incentives and reforms to facilitate construction of affordable housing. Is that right?
Sounds good.
Is that acceptable to the maker and seconder?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Very good. Anyone else? All right. We have a motion by Supervisor Vargas, a second by Supervisor Lawson-Remer to select option 2, direct staff to develop an inclusionary ordinance, predetermined set aside based on the following: developer options for an inclusionary ordinance applicable to all housing projects of all sizes above a minimum threshold, including options for incentives and reforms to help facilitate construction of affordable housing. Any final thoughts? Ask the clerk to call the roll, please.
Thank you. Supervisor Anderson?
Aye.
Supervisor Lawson-Remer?
Aye.
Supervisor Desmond?
Aye.
Vice Chair Vargas?
Vargas, aye.
Chair Fletcher?
Fletcher, aye.
That motion passes unanimously with all supervisors being present and voting aye.
All right, let's go to number 3. I think this one will be a little easier. All right, so on this one, we just have 2 options here: develop options, expanded density bonus, or monitor progress of existing low-income density programs and develop an expanded density bonus program for middle-income families. Any board member comments on this one?
Comment.
Remer. Oh, yep.
Okay, sorry. I just would say, I think when staff is telling us that there's no market incentive and there's no reason to incentivize something that the market's already going to provide, which is really what I heard them saying, then it really seems like an unfair burden on taxpayers to be paying for something that the market's already providing. So I think given the staff analysis and the tax impact, the taxpayer burden, I would support option 2.
Got it. So I have a motion to adopt option 2. I would second that. Let's go to any other board member. All right. Hearing none, we have a motion by Supervisor Lawson-Remer, a second by myself for option 2 on item 3. Ask the clerk to call the roll.
Thank you. Supervisor Anderson?
Aye.
Supervisor Lawson-Remer?
Aye.
Supervisor Desmond?
Aye.
Vice Chair Vargas?
Vargas, aye.
Chair Fletcher?
Fletcher, aye.
That motion passes unanimously with all supervisors being present and voting aye.
All right, let's go to number 4, our safety element. So on this one, we obviously have everything that is currently in the current approach now, 1 through 6 that you see right there. We have the option to add to this, again, to, this would come back to us for discussion. I want to be clear, I don't think there's any desire to take anything away from 1 through 6. So anything that we talk about additive would be in addition to the things that we already do. So are there any board member things that you think should be added to this section?
I'll move approval. Desmond.
I'll second.
All right, we have a motion and a second for option 1. This is to allow the continuation of the draft adaptation goals for the board's consideration. Any questions, comments? All right, ask the clerk to call the roll.
Thank you. Supervisor Anderson?
Aye.
Supervisor Lawson-Remer?
Aye.
Supervisor Desmond?
Aye.
Vice Chair Vargas?
Vargas, aye.
Chair Fletcher?
Fletcher, aye.
That motion passes unanimously with all supervisors being present and voting aye.
All right, number 5, environmental justice element. We will go first to Vice Chair Vargas.
Thank you, Chair Fletcher. So on this one, I appreciate the starting point by staff in utilizing the CalEnviro Screen 3.0 state screening tool and adding the live well indicators. Both of these efforts provide scientific as well as health data. I think it's important to continue to connect to the state definition of environmental justice, which aligns with the state climate. And what's important here is for us to eventually be able to have our own environmental justice definition indicators. I think Sarah mentioned this earlier today, but I do recommend continuing the outreach process to the 17 census tracts and communities that have been identified and expand the environmental justice definition, as it's important to identify other indicators and needs affecting communities differently. So for expanding this work, I believe it's important to get to a definition of what a quality community looks like. And this will only be done with additional community engagement in order to ensure that the opportunity is there for capturing our community's perspectives and needs. There should be a public participation plan for this. I think that's critical for that process. And it also, I think it's my understanding that Enviro screen indicators are updated and data can be amended to provide a refinement of that data. And so I would encourage analysis by staff to identify if we can provide data updates for the screening tool and identify if there are any data gaps that the county can advocate for refinement at the state level as well. So we look forward to providing more input and assistance in the development of additional EJ indicators. And so I think we're moving in the right direction with this one.
Okay, is that option 3?
All of them.
Okay. Let me just ask staff, is it possible to do all 3?
Supervisor, the approach would be to continue with option 1, have that completed by the summer of this year. If option 3 is chosen, or option 2, we could continue with that work. That will extend the work effort past the summer, and we can incorporate those into a future iteration of the environmental justice.
Yeah, I mean, Supervisor Vargas, so we can do that, or we could go with 2 or 3 and start moving a little quicker for completion. Again, we've got 1 adoption in June, completion after June, completion after June. So I guess we could do 1 with the understanding that when we complete 1, the work will begin on efforts around 2 and 3.
Yeah, and then the only reason I think I brought this up this way is because I know that there's a deadline for the June, and I don't want us to stop and not move forward with that, and then immediately begin the parallel process for the other ones as well.
Okay. All right. We have county staff. Does that work? I think we're all saying the same thing.
Yes, Chair Fletcher, that works for us. We will, for purposes of options 2 and 3, we will just ensure that those standards under option 2 are ones that we engage the community on as we receive their feedback.
So essentially, Sarah, what we're doing is just taking those 3 things in option 2 and dumping them down in option 3, right?
That's right.
Okay. So let's do it that way. So we have a motion by Supervisor Vargas to adopt option 1, bring that back for board adoption in June of 2021, and then begin work on option 3 with the addition of California Department of Water Resources, DACS, California Healthy Place Index, and state low-income communities included into the work that is factored into community input. All right, I will second that. Go to Supervisor Desmond.
I'm sorry, okay, I got cut off. My internet went out a couple times during that item. So it's basically option 1, and then we're lumping option 2 into option 3. Is that what I understand?
For after the completion of option 1, to begin to explore those and then bring some of that back. We want to get our EJ part done for adoption in June 21, and then after the kind of baseline is done, begin to explore what other options may be out there.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it, because I think we absolutely need to do option 2. So if it's part of option 3, that's fine.
Perfect.
So
Yeah, we just folded those criteria into 3. Supervisor Anderson.
I don't mean to be smug, but I just want to point out, no matter what option we choose, District 2 will be at the top of the list. As we looked at the overlays, I don't know if you all noticed, but when I talk about the poverty and the challenges in my district, it should be apparent after looking at the overlays. Thank you. I'll be happy to support it.
All right, thank you, Supervisor Anderson. All right, so we have a motion by Supervisor Vargas, a second by myself, adopting option 1, taking the 3 criteria in option 2 and including them in potential new data sources in option 3. With that, I'll ask the clerk to call the roll.
Thank you. Supervisor Anderson?
Aye.
Supervisor Lawson-Remer?
Aye.
Supervisor Desmond?
Aye.
Vice Chair Vargas?
Vargas, aye.
Chair Fletcher?
Fletcher, aye.
That motion passes unanimously with all supervisors being present and voting aye.
I'll ask the clerk if we could just pull up the top 2 recommendations. These are kind of standard, but I think we need to vote on these. I'll make a motion to adopt both of these, just finding that today's actions are exempt from CEQA and receive the presentation and information provided to us.
I'll second.
All right, motion and a second. Supervisor Anderson, is your hand up from before or still up?
Oh, no, I apologize. I wanted to second.
You're waving.
You're to second it.
All right, thank you. Motion by myself, second by Vice Chair Vargas, and it's just the top 2 things right there under recommendations. I'll ask the clerk to call the roll.
Thank you. Supervisor Anderson?
Aye.
Supervisor Lawson-Remer?
Aye.
Supervisor Desmond?
Aye.
Vice Chair Vargas?
Vargas, aye.
Chair Fletcher?
Fletcher, aye.
That motion passes unanimously with all supervisors being present and voting aye.
Thank you. Thank you to staff and team and everyone for working through that. Well, that concludes the business before the board.
Nathan, sorry, Chair Fletcher.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, just if we need to wait till the subsequent meeting, that's fine. There was an item that wasn't addressed or put on the table as part of the housing conversation. And I wanted to move that as part of that conversation, but it wasn't put out as an option.
Oh, what was that?
I wanted to ask staff to explore the possibilities around reducing, streamlining the regulatory and approval process for affordable housing units as part of their housing element.
Yeah, that was included in number 2, option 2, including incentives and reforms to facilitate the construction of affordable housing.
Great. As long as that's clear to everyone that was included, I'm happy. Thank you.
Yep, good, cool. All right, I think that concludes the business before the board today. We have no adjournments in memory, and look forward to joining you all at our next board meeting. And with that, our meeting stands adjourned.
The next meeting of the board will take place on Tuesday, February 23rd, 2021 at 9:30 a.m. for a board conference on probation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Number 10.